Old man saved 3 bear cubs. Years later, you won't believe how they returned the favor. The first snow of the season fell gently outside Walter Bennett's cabin window. At 78 years old, Walter had witnessed enough winters to know this one would be harsh. The weather forecast had predicted heavy snowfall for the next week, but Walter wasn't concerned. He had stocked his pantry weeks ago, chopped enough firewood to last until spring, and made sure his generator was in working order. Living alone on the outskirts of Cedarbrook at the foot of the Cascade Mountains had taught him to be prepared. Walter pulled his wool cardigan tighter around his thin frame and shuffled across the wooden floor to stoke the fire. The flames danced higher, casting a warm glow throughout the small living room. Photographs lined the mantel above the fireplace, most of them featuring a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, Marion. Even after 15 years, the ache of her absence hadn't diminished. Sometimes, in the quiet moments before dawn, Walter would reach across the bed expecting to find her there. He settled into his favorite armchair, the one with the worn armrests and sagging cushion. A book lay open on the side table, one of the many novels Marion had loved. Walter had been reading through her collection one by one, as if completing them might somehow bring him closer to her. As a former elementary school teacher who had shaped young minds for over 40 years, Walter had always appreciated literature, but these books held special significance. The soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner and the occasional crackle from the fireplace were the only sounds that broke the silence. Walter's gaze drifted toward the window, where he could see his small garden now covered in a thin blanket of white. Come spring, he would plant tomatoes, carrots, and Marion's favorite, sunflowers, just as he had done every year since she'd passed. A set of headlights cutting through the darkness outside pulled Walter from his thoughts. Visitors were rare, especially in this weather. He placed his reading glasses on the table and made his way to the front door, curiosity outweighing caution. By the time Walter opened the door, a young man in a park ranger uniform was already climbing the porch steps, carrying what appeared to be a large wooden crate. Snowflakes gathered on the brim of his hat and the shoulders of his heavy jacket. Luke, Walter squinted, recognizing one of his former students. Luke Travers had been a bright-eyed second grader in Walter's class some 20 years ago, always fascinated by nature and the wildlife that surrounded Cedarbrook. Now, as a park ranger, he was living that passion. Mr. Bennett, Luke's voice was slightly breathless, either from the cold or the weight of whatever he was carrying. "I'm sorry to bother you so late, but I didn't know where else to go." "What's in the crate, son?" Walter asked, noticing movement inside. Luke's expression turned somber. "Black bear cubs. 3 of them. Poachers killed their mother this morning up near Blackwater Ridge." He shifted the crate carefully, and Walter caught a glimpse of small dark shapes huddled together. The wildlife centers are all at capacity because of the early winter, and these little ones, his voice trailed off. Walter understood immediately. "You want me to take them in?" It wasn't a question. Luke nodded, relief washing over his features. "Just temporarily, until space opens up at one of the rehabilitation centers." "I know it's a lot to ask, Mr. Bennett." "Bring them inside," Walter interrupted, stepping back from the doorway. "It's too cold out here for this conversation." Once inside, Luke placed the crate on the kitchen floor. Walter knelt down, his old knees protesting, and peered inside. 3 pairs of eyes stared back at him, frightened, confused, but somehow trusting. The cubs couldn't have been more than a few months old. "The poacher?" Walter asked, not taking his eyes off the cubs. "Sheriff Jenkins caught him. He's in custody," Luke replied. But the damage was done. Walter watched as one of the cubs, slightly larger than the others, shifted protectively in front of its siblings. Another remained in the corner of the crate, trembling visibly. The third seemed more curious, pawing at the edge of the crate. "I don't know the first thing about caring for bear cubs," Walter admitted. Luke pulled a folder from his jacket. "I brought some information from the Wildlife Service. Diet, behavior, everything you'll need to know. I can help set up a temporary enclosure tomorrow, and I'll check in every few days." Walter was silent for a long moment. Taking care of these cubs would be nothing like the cats and dogs he'd had throughout his life. Bears were wild animals, unpredictable, potentially dangerous as they grew. And yet, as he looked at the three orphaned creatures, something stirred within him. Perhaps it was the teacher in him, the part that had dedicated his life to nurturing and guiding the young. "They have names?" Walter finally asked. Luke shook his head. "Not yet." Walter studied the cubs more carefully. "This one," he pointed to the protective one, "is Milo." The name had come to him instantly, though he couldn't say why. "The shy one in the corner is Fern. And this curious troublemaker," he gestured to the third, "is Ash." Luke smiled. "Those fit perfectly." That night, after Luke had left with a promise to return the next morning with supplies, Walter made a makeshift bed for the cubs in his laundry room. He'd carefully transferred them from the crate using thick gloves, as Luke had advised. Each cub had whimpered and snuffled, but none had shown aggression, only fear. Walter sat on the floor beside them, watching as they huddled together for warmth and comfort. "Your mama would be proud of how brave you're being," he whispered, not sure if he was speaking to the cubs or to himself. Loss was something Walter understood all too well. As promised, Luke arrived early the next morning with supplies and two friends, both former students of Walter's who had grown up to become carpenters. By midday, they had constructed a sturdy wooden enclosure beside the cabin, complete with a small shelter to protect the cubs from the elements. "Remember, Mr. Bennett," Luke cautioned as they moved the cubs to their new space, "minimal human contact is crucial. We don't want them getting too comfortable around people. The goal is to eventually release them back into the wild." Walter nodded, though he felt an unexpected pang at the thought of the cubs leaving. Already, he had noticed their distinct personalities emerging. Milo, the largest, was indeed the protector, always keeping watch over his siblings. Fern, the female, remained timid but showed signs of curiosity when she thought no one was watching. And Ash lived up to his name, mischievous and energetic, always the first to investigate anything new. The following weeks brought a steep learning curve for Walter. He learned to prepare the cubs' food, a special formula that mimicked their mother's milk, supplemented with fruits and insects, as Luke instructed. He wore a mask when feeding them to prevent them from associating human scent with food. He monitored the surveillance cameras Luke had installed to ensure the cubs were adjusting properly. Despite the precautions, Walter found himself growing attached. He would sit for hours near the enclosure, observing the cubs' interactions. They wrestled and played, climbed the small trees Luke had placed in the enclosure, and slept curled up together in a pile of fur and warmth. Word of Walter's temporary charges spread through Cedarbrook, a town small enough that secrets rarely remained so for long. Most residents kept their distance, understanding the importance of minimal human interaction for the cubs' future survival. But there were a few who brought supplies, fresh berries, fish from the local stream, and once, a honeycomb wrapped carefully in wax paper. Sheriff Ron Jenkins made an official visit, clipboard in hand. "Just checking that everything's above board," he explained, though his eyes softened when he saw the cubs playing in their enclosure. "Those poachers ought to be locked up for good." Walter simply nodded. He had his own opinions on what should happen to those who orphaned innocent creatures, but he kept them to himself. As winter deepened, the cubs grew rapidly. What had once been small, helpless bundles of fur were now active, robust young bears with distinct personalities and increasing independence. Luke visited regularly, bringing updates from the Wildlife Service and checking on the cubs' progress. "The transition to natural food sources is going well," Luke observed one afternoon, watching as the cubs devoured a mixture of berries, nuts, and fish. "Soon we'll need to start introducing live prey." Walter frowned. The thought of releasing mice or rabbits into the enclosure for the cubs to hunt didn't sit well with him, but he understood the necessity. If the cubs were to survive in the wild, they needed to develop hunting skills. "You're doing an amazing job with them, Mr. Bennett," Luke said, noticing Walter's expression. "I know it's not easy." Walter shrugged. "They make it worth it." It was during the coldest part of winter that Milo fell ill. The cub stopped eating, his normally alert eyes became dull, and he lay listlessly in the corner of the shelter while his siblings continued their play. Walter noticed immediately and called Luke in a panic. "Could be any number of things," Luke said after examining the cub from a distance. "I've called a wildlife veterinarian, but she can't make it up here until the road's clear, probably not for at least 3 days. Walter's heart sank. 3 days seemed like an eternity when looking at Milo's weakened state. "What can I do?" Luke provided instructions for creating a more isolated space for Milo, administering fluids, and monitoring his temperature. "Keep me updated hourly," he said before leaving. "And Mr. Bennett, try not to get too close. Even sick bears can be unpredictable." But as night fell and Milo's condition worsened, Walter found himself unable to maintain that distance. He moved a cot into the small shed attached to the enclosure, close enough to hear Milo's labored breathing. Every few hours, he would carefully approach the sick cub, administering the medicine Luke had left and offering small amounts of water. On the second night, during a particularly fierce snowstorm, Walter woke to find Milo standing unsteadily at the edge of his isolated space, whimpering softly. Without thinking, Walter reached out, gently stroking the cub's head. Milo leaned into the touch, his eyes closing briefly. "You're going to be just fine," Walter whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're a fighter, Milo, just like your mama must have been." For 3 days and nights, Walter barely slept, his focus entirely on nursing Milo back to health. When the veterinarian finally arrived, she found a much improved cub and an exhausted old man. "You've done an exceptional job," she said, examining Milo thoroughly. "He's past the worst of it now." Walter felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The relief was overwhelming, bringing tears to his eyes that he quickly blinked away. It wasn't until that moment that he realized just how deeply he had come to care for these 3 wild creatures. As spring approached, the cubs continued to grow and thrive. They were nearly a year old now, and their dependence on Walter had diminished significantly. Luke and the Wildlife Service had gradually implemented a plan to prepare them for eventual release, reducing human contact even further, introducing more challenging feeding scenarios that mimicked natural foraging, and expanding their enclosure to include more varied terrain. Walter understood the necessity of these changes, even as they created a growing distance between him and the cubs. He watched from afar as they became more self-sufficient, their instincts sharpening. Milo, now fully recovered, had grown into a strong young bear with a commanding presence. Fern had overcome much of her timidity, often leading her brothers in discovering new food sources. And Ash remained the adventurous one, always testing boundaries and exploring. It was a crisp morning in early April when Luke arrived with news. "The Wildlife Rehabilitation Center has space now," he said, his expression a mixture of satisfaction and sympathy. "They're sending a transport team tomorrow." Though Walter had known this day would come, the announcement still felt like a physical blow. He nodded silently, his gaze fixed on the cubs, as they played in the morning sunlight, unaware that their lives were about to change once again. "They'll be well cared for," Luke assured him. "The center has an excellent success rate with reintroductions to the wild." "I know," Walter replied, his voice steady despite the ache in his chest. "It's what's best for them." That night, Walter sat near the enclosure, watching the cubs for hours. They seemed to sense something was different, approaching the edge nearest to him more frequently than usual. Milo, in particular, kept returning to press his nose against the wire, his dark eyes fixed on Walter. "You're going home tomorrow," Walter told him softly. "Back to where you belong. You'll be free." The next morning, a team of wildlife specialists arrived with Luke. They worked efficiently, tranquilizing each cub and carefully transferring them to specialized transport crates. Walter stood nearby, his hands clenched at his sides, fighting the urge to interfere. As they loaded Milo, the last of the three, into the transport vehicle, the young bear stirred slightly, the sedative beginning to wear off. He lifted his head, meeting Walter's gaze, and let out a soft snort before the crate door closed. Walter felt tears slide down his weathered cheeks. "Goodbye, little ones," he whispered as the vehicle pulled away, carrying the cubs toward their new future. The cabin felt eerily quiet that night. Walter moved through the rooms restlessly, unable to settle. He found himself standing before the now empty enclosure, remembering the three small cubs that had arrived in a wooden crate on a snowy evening, changing his life in ways he could never have anticipated. In the distance, an owl hooted, its call echoing through the trees. Walter turned his gaze toward the forest, vast and primeval in the moonlight. Somewhere out there, beyond the mountains and valleys, his three bears would eventually find their place. The thought brought both pain and a strange sense of peace. "They'll be okay," he said aloud, as if Marion might be listening. "They're strong, all three of them." As weeks turned into months, Walter gradually returned to his old routines. He tended his garden, now flourishing with summer vegetables. He read on the porch in the evenings, the novels Marion had loved. He exchanged pleasantries with neighbors when he ventured into town for supplies. But each night before retiring, Walter would step outside and look toward the distant trees. Sometimes, he thought he could sense a presence watching from the shadows, a feeling rather than anything he could pinpoint. On those nights, he would raise his hand in a small gesture of acknowledgement before turning back to the warmth of his cabin. Life continued, quieter than before, but no less meaningful. And if Walter occasionally left a handful of berries at the edge of the clearing, well, that was between him and the forest. Autumn painted the Cascade Mountains in brilliant hues of red and gold before giving way to winter once again. The first anniversary of the Cubs' release passed quietly, marked only by Walter's silent toast to their memory as he sat before the fireplace. Luke visited occasionally, bringing updates from the wildlife center. "They're doing exceptionally well," he reported on his last visit. The rehabilitation team says they've never seen cubs adapt so successfully. They're tracking them with radio collars, and all three have established territories not far from each other. Walter nodded, feeling a swell of pride. Always knew they were special. The winter proved harsh, with snowstorms more frequent and severe than in previous years. Walter found himself increasingly isolated as roads became impassable for days at a time. He maintained his independence stubbornly, despite offers from townsfolk to check on him or bring supplies. "I've weathered worse than this," he told Sheriff Jenkins when the man called to check on him. "Been taking care of myself for 15 years now." But age was beginning to make itself known in ways Walter couldn't ignore. His joints ached more persistently in the cold. Tasks that had once been simple, chopping wood, clearing the porch of snow, now left him winded and exhausted. Still, he persisted, unwilling to concede to time what the elements couldn't claim. It was on one of the coldest nights of the season, with snow falling heavily outside, that Walter heard the sound of a vehicle approaching. He glanced at the clock, nearly midnight, an unusual hour for visitors, especially in such weather. Curious but cautious, he moved to the window, peering through the frost-etched glass. A white van had pulled up outside, its headlights cutting through the swirling snow. Two men emerged, dressed in what appeared to be utility company uniforms. Walter frowned. He hadn't reported any issues with his power or phone line, and midnight seemed an odd time for routine maintenance. The knock, when it came, was authoritative. Walter opened the door a crack, chain still in place. "Can I help you?" "Good evening, sir," the taller of the two men said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "We're from Mountain Electric. Got a report of a potential line problem in this area. Need to check your connection points inside." Walter's suspicion deepened. At this hour? In this weather? "Storms knocked out power to half the county," the man replied smoothly. "We're working overtime to prevent more outages. Won't take but a minute." Walter noticed the lack of a logo on their van. The absence of proper identification badges. Most telling of all was the way the second man's eyes darted past him, scanning the interior of the cabin with too much interest. "I appreciate your dedication," Walter said, matching the man's pleasant tone. "But I haven't had any issues. Maybe check back in the morning if you're still concerned." The taller man's expression hardened slightly. "It's really in your best interest to let us take a look now, sir. Preventative measures and all that." Walter began to close the door. "I'll take my chances, thanks." A foot wedged into the narrowing gap. "I don't think you understand," the man said, all pretense of courtesy gone. "We're coming in." The second man moved forward, producing something from his jacket that caught the porch light, the metallic gleam of a handgun. "Nice and easy, old man. We don't want any trouble." Walter's mind raced. These weren't utility workers. They were thieves, possibly worse. Living alone at the edge of town, he'd always been a potential target, but the severe weather had likely made them desperate enough to risk it. "All right," Walter said, affecting a tremor in his voice that wasn't entirely feigned. "Just don't hurt me. I'll cooperate." He unlatched the chain, allowing the door to swing open. The men entered quickly, closing the door behind them. "Sit down," the armed man ordered, gesturing toward the armchair. "Where do you keep your valuables?" Walter lowered himself into the chair, his eyes darting toward the kitchen. I don't have much. Some cash in a coffee can in the cupboard. Old watch that was my father's. The taller man began searching through drawers while his partner kept the gun trained on Walter. Any guns in the house? Jewelry. No guns, Walter replied truthfully. My wife's jewelry went to our niece when she passed. The man snorted. Better hope we find something worth our while, then. Walter sat quietly, appearing compliant while his mind worked furiously. The back door through the kitchen led to the yard. Beyond that, the forest. If he could create a distraction. Mind if I use the bathroom? Walter asked, his voice deliberately shaky. Old man's bladder, you know how it is. The armed man frowned but nodded toward the hallway. Make it quick. And don't try anything stupid. Walter shuffled down the hall, closed the bathroom door loudly, then silently opened the window, too small for him to fit through, but it would serve another purpose. He flushed the toilet, ran the water briefly, then crept back down the hall. The men were occupied in the living room, pulling books from shelves and appending cushions. Walter slipped into the kitchen, grabbed his coat from the hook by the back door, and in one fluid motion that belied his age, unlatched the door and burst outside. The cold hit him like a physical blow, the snow nearly knee-deep. Behind him, he heard shouts of alarm, then the sound of pursuit. Walter pushed forward, heading for the tree line. If he could make it to the dense forest, he might have a chance. His lungs burned with each breath of frigid air. His legs, not as strong as they once were, struggled through the deep snow. Behind him, he heard the men gaining ground, their younger bodies more capable of navigating the difficult terrain. Walter reached the first trees just as his foot caught on a hidden root. He went down hard, pain shooting through his ankle. Gritting his teeth, he tried to stand, but the ankle wouldn't bear his weight. He crawled forward, seeking cover in the underbrush, knowing it was futile. The sound of the men crashing through the snow grew louder. Walter turned his back against a large pine, prepared to face whatever came next. The falling snow created a curtain of white, limiting visibility to just a few yards in any direction. There he is, one of the men's voices carried through the darkness. Old fool thought he could run. Walter saw their shadowy figures approaching, one still holding the gun. He closed his eyes briefly, a strange calm settling over him. He thought of Marion, of their life together, of the 3 bear cubs who had brought unexpected joy to his final years. That was when he heard a low rumbling growl that seemed to emanate from the forest itself. Walter's eyes snapped open. The men had frozen in place, their heads turning frantically to locate the source of the sound. What the hell was that? The armed man hissed. The growl came again, deeper this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy bodies moving through the underbrush. And then, emerging from the swirling snow-like apparitions, 3 massive black forms materialized. Walter's breath caught in his throat. Bears, fully grown black bears, their powerful bodies dwarfing the men who stood between them and Walter. 3 pairs of eyes gleamed in the darkness, focused intently on the intruders. Jesus Christ, the taller man whispered, his earlier confidence evaporating. Back away slowly. The armed man raised his gun with a shaking hand. Stay back. I'll shoot. The largest bear, positioned slightly ahead of the others, rose onto its hind legs, towering over 6 feet tall. It released a roar that seemed to shake the very air, a declaration of intent that required no translation. The armed man fired in panic, the shot echoing through the forest. The bear flinched but didn't fall. If anything, the gunshot seemed to galvanize all 3 bears. They advanced in unison, a coordinated front that spoke of something beyond mere animal instinct. "Run!" the taller man screamed, already turning to flee. His partner hesitated, firing once more before the bear on the right, slightly smaller but quick as lightning, lunged forward. With one powerful swipe of its paw, it sent the man sprawling into the snow, the gun flying from his grasp. The man scrambled to his feet, blood streaming from a gash on his face, and bolted after his companion. The bears made no move to pursue, standing their ground as the sounds of the men's panicked retreat faded into the night. Walter remained motionless, his back still pressed against the tree, his injured ankle throbbing with each heartbeat. The bears turned toward him, their massive heads swinging in his direction. Fear gripped him momentarily. These were wild predators, after all, not the cubs he had once known. But as the largest bear approached, moving with surprising gentleness through the snow, Walter saw something in its eyes that struck a chord of recognition. "M.O.," he whispered, the name escaping his lips before he could consider the absurdity of it. The bear paused, its head tilting slightly. It sniffed the air, then moved closer until it was just feet away from Walter. Slowly, deliberately, it lowered itself to the ground beside him, its massive body blocking the worst of the wind and snow. The other two bears, one with a distinctive patch of lighter fur on its chest that Walter remembered from the timid cub, the other with the same curious tilt of the head that had characterized the mischievous one, settled nearby, creating a protective circle. Walter felt tears freezing on his cheeks. "You came back," he murmured, his voice breaking. "You all came back." Milo, for Walter was now certain it was him, stretched his neck forward, his wet nose gently touching Walter's outstretched hand. The gesture was so reminiscent of the way the cub had pressed against the enclosure wire that Walter felt his heart might burst with the wonder of it. They remained that way as the snow continued to fall, an old man and three wild bears sharing a moment of impossible connection. Walter's injured ankle and the cold became distant concerns, overshadowed by the miracle unfolding around him. Eventually, Milo shifted, moving to position himself alongside Walter. With careful movements, the bear seemed to offer his side, a solid support that Walter could lean against. "You want me to hold on to you?" "Oh," Walter asked incredulously. Milo remained still, waiting. Understanding dawned on Walter. The bear was offering him a way back to safety. Gingerly, he gripped the thick fur and pulled himself up, keeping his weight off the injured ankle. Milo rose slowly, allowing Walter to maintain his hold. Step by cautious step, with Walter leaning heavily against the bear's side, they made their way back toward the cabin. The other two bears flanked them protectively, their massive bodies creating a path through the snow. When they reached the edge of the clearing, Walter saw that the thieves' van was gone. Milo guided him all the way to the porch steps before stopping. Walter released his hold on the bear's fur, balancing on his good foot. "Thank you," he said simply, knowing the words were inadequate for what had transpired. Milo made a soft huffing sound, then turned to rejoin his siblings at the tree lean. The three bears lingered there, watching as Walter hobbled up the steps and into his cabin. Only when the door closed behind him did they melt back into the forest, silent guardians returning to their domain. Inside, Walter collapsed onto the sofa, his body trembling from cold, pain, and lingering adrenaline. He reached for the phone to call for help, then paused, wondering who would believe his story. After a moment's consideration, he dialed Luke's number. The young ranger arrived within the hour, bringing Sheriff Jenkins with him. They found Walter wrapped in blankets before the fire, his swollen ankle propped on a cushion. You're saying bears, 3 specific bears, saved you from armed robbers? Jenkins asked after Walter had recounted the night's events. Walter nodded firmly. I know how it sounds, Ron, but they were my cubs, Milo, Fern, and Ash. They came back. Luke, who had been examining tracks in the snow outside, returned to the living room. There's definitely evidence of a struggle out there. Human footprints running away from the property. Blood in the snow. And bear tracks, 3 distinct sets, circling around to where Mr. Bennett says he fell. Jenkins rubbed his chin thoughtfully. The Wildlife Center did release those cubs not far from here last spring, and black bears are known to have remarkable memory and intelligence. He shook his head, a smile tugging at his lips. Never would have believed it if I hadn't seen the evidence myself. Walter was taken to the hospital in Cedarbrook, where his ankle was determined to be badly sprained but not broken. News of the incident spread quickly through the small town, both the attempted robbery and the extraordinary intervention of the bears. Many expressed skepticism about the latter part of the story, attributing it to an old man's imagination or the stress of the situation. But those who knew Walter best, who had witnessed his care for the orphaned cubs, found themselves more willing to accept the possibility of something remarkable having occurred. In the weeks that followed, rangers reported increased bear activity in the area surrounding Walter's cabin. Not aggressive behavior, simply a presence, watchful, alert, as if patrolling a boundary that only they could perceive. They're keeping an eye on you, Luke suggested during one of his visits. It's unprecedented, but not impossible. You were the closest thing to a parent they had during a critical period of development. Walter, now moving about with the aid of a cane as his ankle healed, simply nodded. He didn't need scientific validation for what he knew in his heart. Spring arrived once more, bringing renewal to the mountains. Walter's health, which had suffered during his ordeal, gradually improved with the warming weather. He found himself spending more time outdoors, tending to his garden or simply sitting on the porch, his gaze often drifting to the forest edge. Occasionally, residents of Cedarbrook would report sightings of black bears crossing a distant ridge or tracks found near Walter's property. The bears never approached other homes or showed interest in human activity. They remained wild, as they should be, but with an awareness of one particular human that defied conventional understanding. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of lavender and gold, Walter sat on his porch with a cup of tea. The air was warm, fragrant with pine and wildflowers. From the corner of his eye, he caught movement at the forest edge. A large black bear stood in the clearing, its powerful form silhouetted against the darkening trees. Walter recognized the distinctive stance immediately, Milo, the protector, the firstborn. Neither moved for several long moments. Then Walter raised his hand in a small salute. "I'm okay now," he called softly. "You did good, Milo. You all did good." The bear remained still for another breath, then turned and melted back into the forest, a shadow among shadows. Walter never dismantled the enclosure beside his cabin. Instead, he repurposed it as a garden space, planting Marion's favorite flowers within its boundaries. He installed a state-of-the-art security system, though he often joked to visitors, "I already had the 3 best bodyguards nature could provide." That summer, Walter adopted a golden retriever from the local shelter, a friendly aging dog named Buddy who seemed content to spend his days lounging on the porch or following Walter around the garden. "Just for some old-age company," Walter explained to Luke. "Gets lonely out here sometimes." But on clear nights, when the moon cast silver light across the clearing, Walter would sit on his porch with a book in his lap, Buddy snoring softly at his feet. And if he occasionally glanced toward the treeline, watching for large shadows moving among the pines, that was his secret. Life had come full circle for Walter Bennett. He had given 3 orphaned cubs a chance at survival, never expecting anything in return. Yet in his moment of greatest need, they had remembered. They had returned. They had protected him as fiercely as he had once protected them. In the quiet moments, Walter sometimes imagined Marion sitting beside him, her hand in his, as they watched the forest together. "Family comes in many forms," he would murmur as if sharing the thought with her, "and love leaves marks that time can't erase." In the distance, an owl called into the night. Somewhere deep in the forest, a bear might lift its head at the sound, alert and watchful. And in his cabin at the edge of the wilderness, an old man smiled, knowing he was never truly alone.